I'm Don Sparks, the director of the Delaware Environmental Institute, and it is my honor to welcome you to the inaugural event in DENIN's new Distinguished Scientist Lecture Series. Through this new lecture series, we hope to bring some of the leading academic thinkers to the University of Delaware to share the insights they have gained through years of study of the complex and interrelated systems that support life on Earth. The first speaker in our series, Dr. Pamela Matson, certainly fits the description of leading academic thinker. She is the Chester Naramore Dean of the School of Earth Sciences, the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Professor of Environmental Studies, and a Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. Pam is an interdisciplinary earth scientist who works to reconcile the needs of people and the planet. With disciplinary teams of researchers, managers, and decision makers, she has worked to develop agricultural approaches that reduce environmental impacts while maintaining livelihoods and human well-being. Pam is truly a leader in both scientific and academic circles. She is the founding co-chair of the National Academy's Roundtable on Science and Technology for Sustainability and a past president of the Ecological Society of America. She serves on the boards of the World Wildlife Fund, Climate Central, and Climate Works. She has also served on the Science Leadership Committee for the International Geosphere Atmosphere Program, the U.S. National Academy's Board on Sustainable Development and Committee on America's Climate Choices, and many other national and international groups. At Stanford, Pam co-leads the Initiative on Environment and Sustainability, an effort that brings together faculty from around the university to help solve critical resource and environmental challenges of the century. She is also the scientific director of the Leopold Leadership Program, a program that provides leadership and communications training to environmental scientists and analysts. She is the author of numerous scientific publications and books, including the National Research Council volume titled Our Common Journey, A Transition Towards Sustainability, and her most recent work, Seeds of Sustainability, Lessons from the Birthplace of the Green Revolution, which will be the basis for her talk this afternoon. Pam received her BS degree in biology from the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire, her MS degree in environmental science from Indiana University, and her PhD in forest ecology from Oregon State University. She is a MacArthur Fellow and a Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. I can go on, but I'm sure by now you're really anxious to hear Pam for yourselves. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela Matson.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a great honor to be the first in this distinguished lecture series, and I appreciate the opportunity. I love coming to places like this because you're doing so many interesting things that I can learn from, and I also love sharing what we're trying to do at Stanford. So again, thank you. Thank you, Don, for inviting me. Now, I started my career as a biogeochemist, and I was fascinated by global environmental change in the nitrogen cycle, and the carbon cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. And this was in the day and age when the global environmental change community was just growing up around the world. We were just launching the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, and we were all trying to figure out how the world was changing and why. And I remember something, maybe probably in the early 1990s, of thinking, this is so cool. This is so great. I'm so lucky to be doing this fascinating research, discovering why the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide is increasing in the atmosphere, working with other people to figure out, what's happening on the planet. And it was fun. And then I woke up one morning, literally one morning, woke up and said, wait a minute, this is bad. This is not good. These changes in our global system are really a problem for us and for my children and their children and so on. And almost overnight, I began a shift towards being not just a biogeochemist, but a sustainability scientist. And I want to tell you a little bit of a story of research that illustrates what I mean by that. What is sustainability science, and what is it that makes that different from the kind of biogeochemistry I was doing before? So let me start with the definition of sustainability, since I'm using this term. Of course, lots of people use it in lots of different ways. In the corporate world, they very comfortably use it in terms of the triple bottom line, making decisions that make sense economically, environmentally, and socially. Lots of other ways that the term is used. The way I'm using it here really came from that Board on Sustainable Development effort that led to the book, Our Common Journey. And it's simply a statement of a goal. The goal of meeting the needs of people today and in the future, our needs for food and energy and water and shelter and clothing and education and so on, while at the same time protecting and sustaining the life support systems of the planet. And by that I mean our atmosphere and water systems, our climate system, and the species and ecosystems on land and in the oceans, both managed and natural systems, that provide the things we need and that will have to be there to provide for future generations. So, it's a very simple statement. It's very anthropocentric. It's about human well-being, intergenerational well-being. And it's a very simple statement to make, but it's a huge challenge. And just to get a sense of how big a challenge it is, if we look on the social sides, the meeting the needs of people side, it is true that worldwide some things have gotten a lot better. Lifespans are increasing, infant mortality rates are in decline. More people have access to health care and education than ever before. And yet there are 1 billion or 2 people on the planet who do not have access to things they need. And almost 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. And population is still growing. It'll probably add a couple more billion before we level off sometime towards the end of this century, we hope. So we've got a challenge in meeting the needs of people. Likewise, if you look at the life support system side of the planet, yep, we've improved some things. We've learned how to do some things better. But we have region-wide tides of air pollution. We have climate change. We're losing biodiversity at rates of 100 to 1,000 times faster than background rates, et cetera, et cetera. So we have challenges on both of these sides. And it's for that reason that I think about we're in a transition. We need to move away from this relationship. And this really is the problem. Many of our efforts in the past to meet the needs of people have inadvertently had these unintended negative consequences on the life support system. So just think about energy for a minute. We're burning fossil fuels to meet the needs of people. We're doing it for a reason. It's a great energy resource. It's just that it has a bunch of negative unintended consequences. If we think about food and agriculture, which is going to be the focus of my talk today, same thing. If you look at the last 50, 60 years or so, you see that we have been really very successful at increasing food production, especially the cereals, to keep pace with human population growth. You can see the 50 to 93 Green Revolution years there. We've been very successful, and that we've done that through the use of improved varieties, improved high-yielding genetic material, fertilizer, irrigation, pesticides, et cetera, everything those little plants need to do their thing. And it's been great for people. But unfortunately, there's a bunch of unintended consequences. Land conversions to agriculture are a huge driver of biodiversity loss. The use of fertilizers has taken off around the world, of course, and that has completely changed the global cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon with all kinds of consequences. And when it comes to nitrogen, it's a problem because nitrogen doesn't just stay where we put it on an agricultural system. It hopscotches around the planet as greenhouse gases, as air pollutants, as leaching losses, and into our streams and rivers, and ultimately coastal areas, causing all kinds of problems. So, unintended consequence of our effort to try to increase food production. In fact, all of these, or all of the ones with the star, are being affected by agriculture inadvertently. And the job's not done. We've got to continue to increase food production. We've got a lot more food to grow in order to meet the needs of the population that is coming ahead of us. And we have to be able to do that, meet that, while at the same time reducing the environmental consequences. We have to change this relationship to this relationship. And we don't really know how to do that yet. But we're trying, and we're learning, and we are in, I think, a transition to sustainability. So if we're in that transition, we can ask the question, what is it going to take to move us more quickly along towards sustainability goal? And I have my own answer to that. It's based on, of course, things I've learned and done in my own career and learned from many, many other people. But 3 of the really critical things are here. New knowledge, linking that knowledge to action, and educating leaders. And of course, those are things that we, in a university environment, have a special responsibility for. There are a bunch of other things that we as citizens may have responsibility for. But in this talk, I'm just going to talk about the top 2 in that list. And I'm going to use a case study, a study that I've done with many others in the Yaqui Valley, Mexico, to illustrate that. So back in the mid-1990s, just after that aha moment where I thought, I don't want to just study what's happening, I want to actually help solve the problem, I began work with Roz Naylor, who is a resource economist at Stanford, Ivan Ortiz Monasterio, who is an agronomist at CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Research Institute, with its home base in Mexico, but he works all around the world, and many others. Those others include economists and hydrologists and oceanographers and geographers and water resource managers and farmers and so on. So I'm going to be talking about their work in this presentation. We worked together as a team for 15 years very intensively, and we're still working together at this point. So where's the Yaqui Valley, and why is this an interesting place? It is actually about 250,000 hectares of irrigated wheat agriculture in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. This is in the northwesternmost state of Mexico, Sonora, Mexico. And the irrigated agricultural area is bounded to the left, or to the west, by the Gulf of California, or the Sea of Cortez, it's called. That is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. Literally, all the big environmental organizations are focused there because there's such critical biodiversity in that area. And so the Yaqui Valley is sitting right on that coast. And then to the east are the Sierra Madres, another biodiversity hotspot on the planet. The Yaqui Valley was interesting to us for that reason, but also because it's the home, it's the home of the Green Revolution for wheat. It's where Norman Borlaug and his colleagues in the 1950s and 60s worked to develop new varieties of high-yielding wheat that then got spread throughout the developing world. There's a big research station there for CIMMYT, and it's been a really important place in development of agricultural systems. And the interesting thing there is that the farmers of the Yaqui Valley took advantage of that, have always taken advantage of that. Since they began industrial kinds of agriculture there, they've had access to that research. And you can see from the green line there that that's the Yaqui Valley yields, ranged from around 2 tons per hectare to close to 6 tons per hectare. That increase because of their access to that improved genetic material, partly. I should say that since the late 90s, their yields haven't changed a lot, but they've stayed really high. They're one of the best places in the world in terms of yields of wheat. So that success was partly because they were there taking advantage of this research, new varieties. but also because the government of Mexico, as is true for most governments during these Green Revolution years, highly subsidized the use of fertilizer. And so they started in the 1950s with very little fertilizer being applied, and a lot of people weren't applying it at all, to by 1981, everybody's applying fertilizer, and they're applying about the right amount, according to the agronomists. But you can see they continued to increase the application till the point we started working there, they were close to 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and that's a lot for a 6-month crop cycle. That's a whole lot of nitrogen. So we looked at that when we saw those numbers, we started thinking, well, that could be a problem because they're applying a lot more fertilizer than any crop there could possibly need. Okay, but that's one of the reasons they were successful. They were subsidized to apply fertilizer. Another reason is that they had unlimited access to water in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. So they were receiving water from a couple of big reservoirs on the Yaqui River. The Yaqui River is an enormous watershed, drains something like 80,000 square kilometers of land surface up into the US, actually. And all of the water was going to agriculture. And you can see they use it very inefficiently and actually still do. And that was okay because during the time of the Green Revolution there, they never ran into a drought. Turns out they were just incredibly lucky not to have a drought because it's quite a repeating pattern there. And they finally ran into it towards the late 1990s and early 2000s and had absolutely no approaches, no tools to allow them to decide how to use water sustainably in a drought situation. And what happened is they basically pumped their reservoirs dry and put themselves out of the water business, or out of the agriculture business for a couple of years. So, but water is an important part of their success as well. So you can imagine, just thinking about this, that there are now a bunch of sustainability challenges that have emerged inadvertently because of the kind of agricultural development that's happened in that valley. And our research team has addressed many of these over the 15 or 20 years we've been working there. But the one I want to talk about today is really the one that focuses on nitrogen fertilizer. It's kind of where I started in this business. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story about that. And it's a simple story. One of the things that we wanted to know there is, can they do things differently? Can they still grow cereal crops like wheat, but do it in a way that both increases or maintains at the very least yields, but reduces potential environmental consequences? And in order to address that question, we needed to look, we asked, we need to look at the coupled system. We needed to know something about fertilizer use and its biogeochemical processes. We needed to know something about the agronomic systems. But then we also needed, to understand the economic parts of that social environmental system. And then we needed to begin to evaluate options and alternatives that would make sense from the perspective of that coupled human environmental system. Okay, so in understanding the social environmental system, the first thing we said was, what are they doing? How are they doing their agronomic systems here? And what are the consequences? We could guess at some of them, but what are they really? So the way they apply fertilizer in this area, and this is not unusual actually, is they apply about 250 kilograms, it's 250 tons per acre or kilograms per hectare, to dry soils about a month before they plant. And then they irrigate. And it's because irrigation water is very cheap. They're using it basically as a weed control mechanism. They get the weeds to sprout, they disc them under, and then they plant the crop. But they've added the fertilizer first. And then what happens is the fertilizer is applied as urea, hydrolyzes to ammonium. These are very high pH soils, so some of that ammonium is probably going off to ammonia in that pH-dependent equilibrium. Some of it's being nitrified to nitrate, and in the process emitting NOx, an air pollutant, or emitting nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas. The nitrate is then, under the right conditions, anaerobic conditions, denitrified, again releasing greenhouse gases. So we'd expect all of those things to happen. We also expect to lose both ammonium and nitrate from the system in solution, some of it leaching down through the soil, some of it running off in it's called tailwater of the irrigation water. So we expected all these things to actually be going on here, and a lot in that period before planting occurred. So I'm going to show you just, there are no plants in the ground, lots of fertilizer there, all these things could happen. So we then went out and studied this for a couple of years in farmers' fields, in agricultural experiment stations, and I'm going to show you just a tiny bit of the data from that. And this is hard to see probably, but you can see the blue and red lines. At the top are nitrous oxide, below that nitric oxide. You won't know this, but those are the highest fluxes ever measured anywhere at the time. They probably still are. But they're very high in the early part of the season before the planting occurs even. And then they're lower later on. So 2 years worth of data, pretty much consistent on that. And we went on to measure lots of other things about that I won't bore you with. We looked at nitrate leaching from the systems using lysimeters buried deep in the soil and models of nutrient and water flow out of the system. Estimated up to 25% or so of the nitrogen that's added is getting lost that way, just within the cropping cycle. And then we followed where some of that nitrogen is going into groundwater and also into surface water systems in the area. The Yaqui Valley is connected from land to the ocean by a series of these canals and natural streams. And we followed the nitrogen in those systems. John Harrison did a whole dissertation trying to find out what happens to the nitrogen in those systems. Some fascinating work. I don't know how many of you are interested in biogeochemistry and thermodynamic controls, but really, really cool stuff on that. Shows how much those processes are affecting how much nitrogen goes to the atmosphere versus goes out to the Sea of Cortez. But again, his work showed highest fluxes measured for at least in some of the drainage canals for nitrous oxide. Now, we were beginning to get a sense of what was happening with the agricultural fluxes of nitrogen, but we realized that if we were very interested in what was happening in the coast, we'd also want to have a sense of what else is getting out there. What are the other forms, other sources of nitrogen to be lost from the system? And, for example, livestock production was increasing dramatically during this time. So that could have an effect. The aquaculture had taken off in the valley. This is shrimp aquaculture in the coastal zone of this area, right outside of the agricultural systems, right next to the Sea of Cortez. You can see these data from Amy Lure's PhD dissertation shows the very dramatic increase in those bars in the area of land under aquaculture, driven by some policy changes. But that change had consequences in terms of loss of ecosystems, very important, culturally important ecosystems of the area, but also they added effluents of nitrogen and other things to the marine system. And then there were cities, the development of a city, very rapid growth of Ciudad Obregón. Anyway, we put together, through a lot of work, an estimate of the nitrogen on land moving to the ocean. I guess the bottom line here is to say that most of the nitrogen that's leaving this system most of the nitrogen in this system is coming from agriculture. It's 7-fold more important than any of those other sources, including the human source. So it's a critical player in that. On the other hand, that amount leaving in export is a lot for the ocean, but it still only represents, it's less than 5% of the nitrogen coming into this system. So there's some really interesting questions about where that rest of that nitrogen's going. We'll come back to that if you want. So we have the sense of the importance of agriculture. We have a sense of how much nitrogen is entering the Sea of Cortez. Then the question is, what happens to it? And we found, through another Michael Beeman's dissertation, using both bottom-up approaches where he was measuring denitrification assays and top-down approaches where he was calculating fluxes on the basis of residence time in the estuaries, estimated that maybe up to 30% of that nitrogen gets denitrified in the estuaries before it hits the Sea of Cortez. And then the question is, what happens when it hits, the rest of it gets out to the ocean, to the Sea of Cortez, this biodiversity hotspot? Well, one of the things that happens are huge phytoplankton blooms. You can see one there swirling across the Sea of Cortez, and they happen a lot. So Mike wanted to know whether we could attribute those phytoplankton blooms to the loss of fertilizer from this land system, and used a really, I think, quite interesting and unique approach that was all based on remote sensing. So he used sea-WIFS data. This is 5 years of data here. Used sea-WIFS data to get at chlorophyll. And this is, by the way, across a 100-kilometer gradient across the transect across the Sea of Cortez. Chlorophyll used AVHRR satellite data for sea surface temperature. And if sea surface temperature was cold, it could mean there was upwelling, a natural process that would be bringing nutrients up and causing the phytoplankton bloom. So he kind of subtracted those out. And then he related that to the very synchronous irrigation events that we know, and we know exactly when they happen in the valley. And the bottom line from this research is that 70% of those huge phytoplankton blooms were related to or associated with irrigation events in the valley, irrigation moving the nutrients from that system out into the ocean. So pretty cool study. You know, what happens to it after it gets out into the Sea of Cortez? We don't know. We didn't study. We haven't been able to get the support to do it, but it's an interesting question. And it's an interesting question in some ways in this place because it's such a productive environment already. So it's fascinating that just adding a little more nitrogen can actually have a major effect on how the whole system works. So that's just a little piece of the study of nitrogen in this system. And you know, from it, we basically concluded that the decisions farmers are making in the agricultural fields are having consequences in other places, downstream in the coastal areas and in the Sea of Cortez, downwind, causing air pollution events in the city in the area, Ciudad Obregón, and potentially with nitrogen deposition impacts downwind as well, which is another thing we didn't actually get to study. So farmers' decisions were having a consequence in other places. Now, why do farmers do what they do? And this is a question that I'm not going to go into in nearly so much detail, partly because it's mostly my colleagues who carried out the research there, although I was there tagging along with them on all the surveys and economic analyses. But you know, why do farmers do what they do? And we needed to look at both the economic and the agronomic constraints that they're facing. And the short answer to that is they do what they do for a couple of reasons. First of all, they all said, you know, fertilizers have been awfully cheap. They were subsidized. But by the middle to late 1990s, those subsidies were going away. And when we started our analyses, fertilizer was becoming the most important item in the farm budget. So they were caught in this transition point. They talked about the importance of spreading out their labor over the cropping cycle. Get the fertilizer on early so they can focus on getting the seed later, et cetera, et cetera. They talked about the need to make sure they had enough fertilizer on there early in case it turns out to be a really great year. These are all rational reasons, by the way. And they talked about the fact that experience said it worked. It's been working for them for years. So why not continue? Okay, so now that we understood something about that, we could begin to see where there was room for change. And we began to analyze alternatives that might be win-win, that would still produce food at the same rate or better, but reduce the environmental consequences. And we used field experiments and model simulations and so forth. The field trials in the farmers, in the egg experiment station, showed pretty clearly that there were some great optimal management strategies. For example, if you apply 180 kilograms of fertilizer instead of 250, but apply it at planting or after, you can more than meet the demand of the crop and maintain yields, maybe even improve grain quality because you're adding fertilizer closer to when the grain is filling, when the crop really needs it. You can reduce nitrogen losses tenfold, and you can save between 12 and 18% of after-tax profits. So that's a darn good win-win. And by the way, we published that in Nature, and could have walked away at that point, but we didn't. So win-win seems quite likely. This optimal treatment where you apply most of it at or after planting is the way to go. Now we wanted to know whether this is just a site-specific thing in the places we happen to be doing the studies, or whether we could count on that happening throughout the whole valley with the different soils there and different climate years and different managers. So we carried out a set of ecosystem simulation models. I'll go through this quickly. We used WINM, the water and nitrogen management model that was developed by Deli Chen and Lee at Melbourne University, and modified it for this site. Worked really great. Basically what we found is that, yes, we're right. Whether we use our optimum management, that best management practice up there at the top, or a site-specific nitrogen management that in the model uses the information about what the soils are actually like and what the climate is in that given year. Either way, it's entirely possible to increase or maintain yields and dramatically reduce the nitrogen losses and save a lot of money. So the win-win was real. So published the paper, but we did more than that. We wanted to make sure that this was actually useful to somebody. That's why we were working there to begin with. So let me just skip that. Just says a little bit about what that new knowledge was like. Use-inspired, focused on both discovery science, but also problem solving. So we wanted then to figure out, to make sure that we were linking this knowledge with decision makers, and that's the farmers. So we did a lot of on-farm trials where the same optimum management practice was working really well. We did farmer workshops and papers and all kinds of stuff, sort of standard ag extension in a sense. And we expected then that everybody would see this as a really smart thing and would shift to it. We expected to see nitrogen fertilizer rates go down from that 250 kilograms per hectare to lower values in the coming years. And then we made the big mistake of actually going to see if that happened. And we found that it didn't. Fertilizer use actually increased. Our surveys said they were using more fertilizer rather than less fertilizer. So obviously, we missed something here. And this is one of the big lessons from this work, by the way. We missed something. We thought we understood how decisions were being made in the valley. But we stepped back and then began to really analyze the decision-making or knowledge system of the valley. So this is what it looked like when we started the research. There we are in universities working with our important colleagues like Ivan Ortiz-Monasterio in CIMMYT and his colleagues in the national extension, with farmer groups, and especially with the innovative farmers themselves. And we thought that was the system that would lead to change. But when we actually analyzed this, when we stepped back and didn't just assume we knew, but analyzed it, the knowledge system that we found looks something like this. A lot more players, a lot more complex, a lot more decision makers in the mix. Some, interestingly enough, out of the mix, even though they should have been in, Secretary of Health, Secretary of Natural Resources, both really without any power or influence in this system. But what was most important is we realized that the credit unions are where the real decisions are being made. And we didn't know that going in it, and the farmers themselves hadn't told us that going into this. So what's going on with the credit unions? Credit unions, by the way, are farmer associations. Farmers pay to belong to them, and they get information, they get advice, they get access to inputs like fertilizer and seeds, they get access to markets, and they get credit. They get They get a loan of money to buy those inputs. So farmers trust them because they belong to them. And what was happening is that the credit unions were telling the farmers to apply just as much as they possibly could. Throw it as much on as you can. That was the advice. Moreover, that advice had strings attached. In a lot of cases, they were saying to farmers, if you want credit, you better just plan to apply a lot of nitrogen. And why were they doing this? Well, of course, partly it was because there was a financial incentive for them to loan more money for fertilizer. But I think really importantly, they were worried about the uncertainty that's out there. They're dealing with different farmers, some with different skills, there are different soils, year-to-year climate variability, a lot of other elements of uncertainty. So given all of that, it probably made sense just to say, put as much on as you possibly can, and everybody will do okay. So when we realized that, we realized we needed to take a completely different strategy. We needed to not develop one optimum that could be used everywhere, but we needed to develop a more site-specific, in situ, real-time kind of information source that farmers and credit unions could use. And this is an example of that, a handheld radiometer that would tell the farmers how much fertilizer their crop needed by basically comparing the nitrogen content of the leaves of the crop to a fertilized strip. And so they knew when and how much to put on because of that. And then, in order to actually see that this was used, we engaged the credit unions in the research. In fact, we engaged the credit unions in buying these things, and we jointly bought them with them, and then using them with the farmers in their own credit unions, and then to try it over and over, year after year. And the answer was, it actually really works well. And farmers don't need to apply nearly as much fertilizer as they were in order to get really good yields. Okay, so that was good news. And I will just say that we went out again in 2012, did a survey to find out had things changed. And the lucky and happy result is that yes, this new technology was being adopted and fertilizer use was going down in a lot of farmers' fields, but it's slow, so slow. The whole valley is not yet using it. And that, to me, is a very clear indicator that another thing we missed, of course we knew it, but we should have been doing it, is to be working at the same time in the policy world in Mexico, trying to encourage the same kinds of rules that we have in the United States and in Europe right now, which ties assistance, financial assistance to farmers to best management practices. Mexico doesn't have that. They have it in the water resources area now, but not here. So, we continue to learn. There's no perfect answer to this. So one thing that came out of that study was the recognition that we need to know a lot more about how to link knowledge and action, how to make that happen. If we're actually doing research that is intended to help solve problems, how do we make sure that link works? And so the Yaqui Valley case study joined with a bunch of other cases in an analysis that I did with the National Academy and also with some other collaborators to try to figure out what works and what doesn't. What works if we want to link knowledge and action? And we compared a whole bunch of different cases in a whole bunch of different areas. And I'll just give you sort of a highlight of the results of the studies. Basically, what we find is that an awful lot of us treat that knowledge to action link as though it's a pipe. We do our study, we write up a paper, the last paragraph of the paper says, and therefore farmers or managers or decision makers should do X, should do ... And we put it out there in the literature. I suppose we can also develop a new technology and sort of put it out there, and we throw it into the pipe, and we figure that somebody's on the other end of that pipe, and they're going to pick it up and use it. They're going to make use of it. But all too often, the research that we are doing doesn't match what the decision makers think they need. There's a sort of a miscomprehension between the two communities. Very often we create great stuff, but we forget to fill in one little gap in the knowledge that is needed to actually use that great stuff. Sometimes, as in our case, the decision maker that we think is there isn't really the decision maker at all. So the bottom line is you can't assume that. Instead, the results of these case studies said basically you need to throw out this idea of the pipeline of transfer and instead develop ways in which you can promote multi-directional, two-way flow of information between decision makers and research communities, maybe even work together. Collaborative, co-production of knowledge is really important. And the other thing the research showed pretty clearly is that if you can identify boundary organizations or individuals, these are people or organizations that have one foot in the research community and one foot in the decision-making community, they will help us, and especially those of us in academia, do a better job of linking our knowledge to action. So look around for those kinds of entities. And as we were talking about earlier today, maybe universities should be creating some of these entities as we did with ag experiment stations. Okay, so those were some of the lessons about linking knowledge to action. And I'll just say that a lot of those kinds of lessons are written up in the last chapter of this book, which is sort of a summary of the Yaqui Valley project. Incredibly helpful to me, but hopefully to a lot of other people as we try to make sure that we're doing research that can actually be helpful for decision making. Now, I'm just going to take a quick second here to give you a little vignette in another place, in China, and to talk about knowledge to action there. So I've got a lot of colleagues working on agricultural systems in China. We know that many Chinese systems are receiving far more nitrogen than they actually need. This is a study that I did with Peter Vatusik and a bunch of others a few years ago, in which we showed that there are some places in the world, like Kenya, where there's just not enough fertilizer being applied, and they're mining their soil out of nitrogen. But there are, at the far other end of the gradient, places like the North China Plain, where they're adding so much nitrogen, way more than they need, and they're losing huge amounts of it. Well, the Chinese agricultural people that I work with know this. In fact, they helped write this paper. They're very aware of it, and so they've been working very hard to develop alternative management practices that would reduce the environmental losses of nitrogen. Now, there's a great paper a few years ago that showed you could, this is the farmer's practice, lots of nitrogen in, lots lost, and that their optimum practice, much like the one that I talked about in the Yaqui Valley, could dramatically reduce both the need for fertilizer and the loss of fertilizer. So that's great news. But that's not really their problem. Unlike a lot of the other parts of the world, they can't just be happy with reducing fertilizer losses. They have to increase yields. They've got a still growing human population and a more consuming human population. They have to increase per capita food production in China. That's driving them. So how are they going to increase yields but also reduce the environmental consequences of it? Again, these are great scientists. They know the issues, and they have developed some simply amazing agricultural systems, really plant soil systems that are optimized for given locations in China, different soils, different climates, and so forth, that actually allow a dramatic increase in yields and a reduction in losses. I won't go through how all of that works, but they've tested this in many different places. This is just a partial list for their maize trials. But what you can see in this system is two things. First of all, here's their study, their new integrated system approach. And you can see when you compare it to farmers, they've got twice the yield in this system with the same amount of nitrogen input. So that's looking pretty good. And that leads to a dramatic reduction in loss of nitrogen. But even when they compare it to the very best farmers in China, you can see those very highest yielding farmer studies and regular studies get around the same yields, but for 3 times more nitrogen. Let's see, I think I had it there, yeah. So in other words, their new integrated system is doing the very best job anybody in China can do in terms of increasing yields and at the same time dramatically reducing the excess of excess nitrogen. And a recent study that came out by this same group of colleagues indicated that if farmers around China could get to even 80% that good as their integrated approach, they'd have more than enough food to feed all of China in 2030. So there's a lot of real effort now to move this kind of knowledge to action. How does that work? How do you get that kind of very sophisticated management practice into the hands of the farmers? Well, I will tell you that at least in the North China Plain, that is a big problem, because agriculture is carried out by hundreds of millions of individual managers managing very small strips of land. So you look at that and you go, how are we ever going to be able to allow great ideas like this to scale? The way that our colleagues are doing it right now is by engaging with farmers and getting the farmers in all kinds of little communities to understand and actually use the new management systems. They're doing the typical extension. But based on our experience in Mexico, I'd say they better also be working at the federal and provincial scales to get policies in place that encourage farmers and farmer groups to switch to the new practices. And it remains to be seen whether that can happen. So I started by saying, I kind of switched from being a biogeochemist to a sustainability scientist. Sustainability science is really an emerging field. You can read it in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and a lot of other areas. It's a science that is use-inspired. It's focused on not just parts of the system, but the whole coupled system. It takes into consideration the complexity that is in real life, and it purposefully tries to link knowledge to action. And that's what I hope more of us can be doing. If we can do that, then there's the room for all these other things here, obviously, including leadership by great universities like this one. But I think if we work together in this, we're going to be able to move this transition to sustainability ahead much more quickly. So I will end there, and I will thank you very much for listening and be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela.
Should we sit down?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll let you go over there. I'll sit here.
Okay. So we'll open it up for some questions from the audience. Maybe I will start and ask you a question. I mean, the scenarios that you presented obviously are a good example of trying to make the research consequential and impactful. And I think really emphasize the need to bring a very interdisciplinary team of scientists together, but beyond that, to take it out to policymakers and the public. So I wonder if you could maybe translate what you've learned in Mexico and with your colleagues in China to tell us a little bit about what you think we should do to address some of these other major environmental challenges. For example, climate change.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think our universities, and I know yours is one and ours is one, focusing on efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gas by changing our energy technologies, by using energy more efficiently, by fuel switching from coal to other things, by building new kinds of solar and wind and battery technologies and so forth. And lots of great work going on. There's also lots of research going on impacts of climate change, trying to figure out who's most vulnerable, who will be affected most by the climate change we're already entrained in. So we're working in academic environments on these kinds of things. And I think what the lesson I would take from this is that while we're doing that work, we better be working very hard to link with the kinds of decision makers that will pick up and run with the new knowledge that we're creating. So I suspect it's the case here, but it certainly is at Stanford, that the corporate world is very interested in the energy technologies area. There's a lot of potential investment in that. And in a sense, we've got a partner in in the translation of this new ideas to technologies that actually can work on the ground, but only if they make a lot of money, right? So what happens if we have technologies that are actually going to cost somebody something? Maybe having government policies in place that encourage that transition, having a carbon fee, for example, would give some support to the new technologies that reduce carbon emissions. There's a policy piece to it that would help in the translation of the new ideas to action. When it comes to climate mitigation, same thing, lots of research going on, but it really needs to be with the communities that would pick those ideas up and employ them in their communities. What makes sense to them? And so research efforts that work together with community leaders and corporations and NGOs to figure out how best to reduce vulnerabilities. That's the way to go in this. And again, I think there are some groups doing it.
Thank you. There's some questions from the audience.
Hi. So I've recently done some research on genetically modified crops, and I wanted to know your opinion on, do you think that they could be a solution for the ever-growing population in terms of food production? And if so, how could we kind of demolish the controversy and stigma that surrounds genetically modified organisms?
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm not sure I have the answer to the second part of that question, but personally, I think that it's very important that we stay open to all options. It is a huge challenge to feed a growing population. There are lots of ways to do it. Reducing waste is one big one, changing diets and all of that, but simply growing more food is an important part of that challenge. Growing more food in a situation where there's a lot more drought in places that are already dry, or maybe very intense rainfall events in places that are wet, those things are going to make the lives of farmers and the effort to grow food more difficult in the future, and those are climate-related changes. That's pretty clearly understood. So I think that as we think about GMOs in that context, they could be incredibly important in increasing drought resistance, for example, in particular areas of the world, of the crops that are being grown there. So we should keep open to it. I do think we should do it carefully, and I'm all for negotiating a peace treaty, I guess you might say. I think that the idea of labeling foods as containing GMOs is perfectly fine. I mean, labeling, the more people know, the better off we'll be on all fronts. Just like I think it'd be nice to know whether your fish are sustainably harvested or not. So we can do that, and that might help alleviate some of the concerns. But the GMO controversy, some of it just comes from it's a knee-jerk gut reaction, and it's really hard to change people's minds, other than to show that it can be done well and may actually help humanity by doing it well.
I'm curious, in a place like Mexico and China, was there initially a lot of suspicion about your motives? And how did you overcome that and have them accept the results of your work and embrace it?
The key to that was Ivan Ortiz Monasterio, our colleague from CIMMYT. He lived in that town, was a member of that community, even though he was a scientist. He still is highly regarded. He's a trusted individual. And one of the things that all of the research that's been done on linking knowledge to action says basically is that you gotta have trust. You've got to be legitimate players there. You've got to be credible. You have to be, in a sense, trustworthy. And I would not have been in that place. I wasn't. So my role and Roz Naylor's role and all of our other colleagues who were not from Mexico were there as part of Ivan's team. Even though, in reality, we're all, equals working together, we were there working with him. And he was our really critical linking person. So we rested on the respect the community had and the trust the community had for him. And I think that's an important lesson for me. That's actually not one that I had to learn there. Anytime I work internationally, I have an international colleague. I have a colleague from that community because I think it's the only way to actually make a difference there. I was just a gringa, believe me.
Thank you very much. It was really a good talk, and in my PhD research, I'm already working on some kind of same idea where you are working on, and my work is focused on innovation in access, which goes to your work, especially when you concluded that how it should go about and how we should develop the two-way mechanisms. In my research, I have, in the field work, I have seen that most of the technology, especially with innovation and access to technology, it's mostly kind of supporting the elites of the society as well as all these other things. And sustainability at the end of the day, the way it is practiced, goes to marginal or medium farmers, and these are the guys who spend a lot of their resource into it. Where international organizations going into these countries, they support big farmers as their main clients. So reviewing different institutional mechanisms, I come to know that there is this agricultural innovation systems approach, and you concluded somewhere around it, but you didn't mention about it. Do you have any comments that World Bank is now coming to this point where they are supporting agricultural innovation systems, that will it proceed somewhere around, will it actually bring the farmers in between the whole circle, or if it will not work in the future? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Really excellent points. You know, I do believe that is an approach that will make a difference, that will get to the people who need it most. The international agricultural research community that led to places like CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Research Institute that Yvonne works at, has been very influential and very important because they have been focused on the poorest of the farmers, not the richest of the farmers. And they are now, they have a very important focus on sustainability in agriculture. And again, for not just the richest farmers, but for the everyday farmer, for the poorest farmers in areas. So having that kind of international and government-funded program, I think, is essential, because you're right, the big companies aren't going to be too worried about it. The other thing I want to say about our project, to your larger point about the power issue, in this valley, everything revolved around agriculture as it was being carried out. The funding from the state was to support big agriculture the way it was being carried out. And the farmers from the valley are the governors of the state. You know, I mean, the power connections are all about the status quo for agriculture. So how would a place like that begin a conversation about sustainability? You know, why would they? And the answer to that is, well, some of the citizens really cared. They were worried about human health issues, you know, groundwater issues and so forth. So the citizens were beginning a conversation about sustainability. But we came in with funding in part from US agencies and the Packard Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation. And those foundations supported us in a way that slowly but surely changed the agenda a little bit. We needed money to work there. We needed resources to do it. In Mexico at the time, all of the resources were going to the status quo agriculture. Nobody was asking if there was a way to do it differently. So it's an interesting question, you know, how do you change the agenda of a place towards sustainability when the power is in the hands of the biggest farmers or the most wealthy farmers? I don't have the answer to that. I think foundations can play a really important role. Universities can play a role, not in forcing an agenda, but changing the conversation in a way. So I'd love if anybody else has ideas on that.
Hi,
Hi, my name's Devika Banerjee. I'm a senior here, and I'm particularly interested by your thoughts on connecting the educational aspects of your study in Mexico and with sustainability. You had mentioned that you did farm trials and farmer workshops, and I'm wondering how did the farmers, what was their reaction to that, and how did they react to these workshops and such?
Yeah. Well, the farmers in this valley had a long experience with the research community because of Norman Borlaug in the 1950s starting to work there. So they actually view that as a very beneficial thing. It's not hard to get farmers to let you do field trials in their farms and to actually work with them to carry out the research. And the farmer workshops and field days are sort of the typical way they had established this. So that part was easy, but that still doesn't mean it changed. And so that's the thing, we always had arguments about this between the economists and some of the rest of us, but they really thought that the money would do everything. Farmers will look at what their neighbor is doing, they'll lean over the fence and they'll see what they're doing and they'll know that they're saving money or making money, and they'll change. And that didn't happen. And I, for a long time, argued that, see economists, you're wrong. It's not all about money. But in the end, it was about money because the credit unions were holding the credit strings. So the farmers were very open to this, and they love the handheld radiometer. They love the precision agriculture at that scale. So that in this place is not an issue.
Pam, if I could ask another question. You're well aware that in this country, particularly at land-grant institutions, we've had an extension service, agriculture extension service, which is now just celebrated 100 years. And I wonder, this is a comment, but I'd like your reaction to it. When we think about a lot of these global challenges that we're facing, I wonder if universities should perhaps form other kinds of extension besides just agriculture as a way to connect more to the public and to policymakers.
I think that you have something there. I think there's a possibility of doing that in a more integrative way. But you could imagine, for example, local institutes. In California, it might be one that a bunch of the UCs and Stanford and others are part of, but it's a regional institute where decision makers and academic researchers can work together or talk together around the challenges of water, energy, food, and they're all intertwined. Climate change, they're all intertwined there. You could imagine the same kind of thing here. The problem is the intertwining. You need a lot of different kinds of expertise to do it, and I think a lot of sophistication then in sharing that information. But I think it's what's needed. I think we need a different kind of extension, and we ought to learn from the best and the worst of the ag extension example and build some for sustainability.
Are there any additional questions? Yes, one here, I think.
Thank you. I just wanted to know your opinion on agricultural innovation systems approach, which we kind of missed in earlier question. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't really answer it before.
Yeah.
Wait, give him back the. Could explain to me exactly what you mean by it, so I make sure I'm talking about the same thing you're talking about. Okay. How is it defined? The systems approach that you're talking about.
I think like agricultural innovation systems, which comes from innovation systems approach, it can be like for the countries or like sectoral or like for that regard. And in the earlier programs, there was these extensions that we are doing research somewhere in US, and then through Green Revolution, this whole thing goes to India and Pakistan and all these countries, and then farmers are using it, and then there are negative externalities coming out of it, as you mentioned it. So farmers are not actually part of that innovation. So they don't know, as you mentioned, all these things, that they don't know what exactly going on. So there is this kind of indigenous knowledge or the practices, everyday practices, which farmers are doing. And so how we can incorporate that whole thing into this research process. That is kind of approach they're talking about. So that is kind of what you concluded with. And then this goes bigger and bigger, like how to bring in different international institutions into it, universities into it, polytechnic institutes, and how to bring farmer as a center of this whole debate, rather than universities or research institutes which are following certain ideas coming from some corporate world, and then it goes to this agricultural sector.
Sure.
So turning it all around. So this is kind of what I just wanted to explain as in terms of agriculture and innovation systems. But the question is, the way it is presented, is it sustainable? Like, is it something that is actually possible? Like, how to go to that level and extract information without having a contextual knowledge of that place? That was my concern.
But that's exactly my point. I mean, I'm not going to jump in someplace and provide all the answers, nor should any of us, because they're not really answers that are going to work. And so when you think about knowledge and integrating knowledge, it's integrating, in this concept, in the sustainability idea, it's integrating maybe the best of Western science, or whatever Northern science, whatever you want to call it, with traditional knowledge in the context of helping decision makers, or providing knowledge that decision makers can use. It doesn't mean making the decisions for them. So in the agricultural area, I think you could, and I know that some of the international agricultural research community works on these things. If you're trying to figure out how to do agricultural systems in regions that are really steep slopes or really kind of challenging environments, they're using the local knowledge about those systems, and the local decision makers are working together. When we talked in the Yaqui Valley about working with the farmers, the farmers are part of the team. And ultimately they're going to be the decision makers. So the research community's job is just to begin to provide some options that make sense under those conditions. I think that there are innovations being developed that are useful in that way. And I don't think it is necessary to assume that anything's going to be pushed on somebody else. I think we've learned a lot, because you're right, there have been times when new technologies have been pushed in a way that's been destructive. So it's just combining new kinds of knowledge in ways that those decision makers think make sense.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Just
I think we will we'll stop at this point. I wanted to mention also that Pam has been here as part of our Delaware Will Shine strategic initiative at the University of Delaware. So she gave a talk this morning, and so we really appreciate that. So please join me in thanking Pam for a wonderful talk this afternoon. And before you do that, we will have a reception in the lobby there. So please join us there, and if you have more questions, I'm sure she'd be happy to talk with you. So thank you very much, Pam.
Thank you.